Here's my game, Binary Dreams, and today I'm going to talk to you all about my dialogue system. This is the second project that I've been using it on, and I've just sort of been expanding it myself, basically since I created it. It's just sort of like an ongoing production. I don't think I'm going to add a whole lot to it anymore over the course of this one project, as to like avoid breaking things. But there's been a massive overhaul during this project from what I had last time. So I'm going to go ahead and open up some of my dialogue system implementation. A class called dialogue. And I should keep in mind that this type is actually generated from XML files, one of which I've got right here. So all of these fields I can fill in. So I've got my scene. I'm just dividing my XML files based on scenes because that just seemed like a reasonable way to format it, so that everything is on in one massive file. And then you got a character, and then you have every dialogue that they have in that scene. And the way that I create their IDs is Kevin, for instance, he's these first two numbers, so 1, 0, because you can't start with 0 as your first digit. It'll just be read in as like 10, the first digit that's non-zero. So he's 10, and then since it's the first ID, I did 0, 1, and I kind of went against my own convention, because on some of them, I have the first dialogue 0 indexed, not this one, but there's definitely some in there that are 0 indexed and some start at 1, because I don't know, it's a solo project, you know. So anyways, the way that I'm going about this is that because I have a lot of things done on a per sentence basis, and this is one of my most recent additions, instead of just a sentence being a string, it's actually a string, an audio clip, and an effect. So the effect actually runs through, and this is the only part of this that's a asset not made by me, but there is a Text Mesh Pro effects asset that I got from the asset store. I don't remember if it was free or if I paid for it. I think I paid for it. I think it was about $10 or something. But it's just a single script that you can place onto Text Mesh Pro game objects, and you can add little effects to them. And I'll show that off a little bit later. So Ascendance has the ability, obviously, string, audio clip, and effect. The string is required. These two are actually not required if they're not included with that sentence. We're doing all right. All of this stuff is used by that asset that I talked about, this Text Mesh Pro effect, to create their effect. If I could have an example of this in this file. Yeah, here's one. So the way that I format it is I look for the caret, because I wasn't using carets for anything else. And so it just goes field by field. So the first one is sketch, which is actually the effect type. So I have a small function just to translate from a string to this enumeration effect type, which is included in the Text Mesh Pro effect asset. We've got, I believe I go in the same order as this effect data, so I think it's duration, amplitude, gradient. So I created a script that just contains a lot of gradients. And I just index. It's just an array of gradients that are all saved as a game object in space, and this is just used to index into them, so I know which one I want to grab. We've got duration ratio, whether or not it's repeating, so a bool, so 0 or 1, and the words that it's affecting. So if I left it blank, I think it would technically affect all of the words, but I always just include a string. So in this case, this right here is going to be affected by that asset, and these asterisks are not going to be affected. So that's sort of how I create all that effect data. And I can show off my XML script a little bit, but it's just kind of simple XML parsing. Nothing too insane going on in that one. At least I think so. It was the first time I've ever done it, so I'd used JSON before in the past, but this is my first foray into XML. So right here we have our sentence audios and effects, which are all conglomerated into this list of sentence data, full sentences. And these should never really be referenced outside of the XML script, but they are used sort of as temporary variables to load in all of the dialogues that a given function call needs to load in. And then once it's loaded all of them in, it generates this list of sentence data. And then we have our options, of course, wonderful little options, as listed right here. So just grab those in. They're just strings, pretty simple stuff. The voice is not the same as sentence audio. Sentence audios are played not looping. They're just played when that sentence appears, whereas voice is the audio clip that loops as sentences are typed in, since sentences are typed character by character. And we got trigger options. I hate the way I named this, but trigger options is which option triggers the dialogue. So there's several pieces of dialogues which contain all of this information. And dialogues move to new dialogues in a couple of different ways. One, of course, is you choose an option. So the first dialogue that you are shown when you talk to this character, Decrepit Robot. So this all displays, and you're given the options. Who are you? Say you select who are you. Well, this dialogue is triggered by who are you, and conversely also by where are we. So both options, it's a false choice. They both trigger the same dialogue, but it gives the player a little bit of something to engage with. It makes it feel like they're, part of their role. It's just a little bit of role playing. It also just sort of breaks up dialogue. You don't want to just be given sentence and sentence by sentence to the player. They're just going to stop reading and they're just going to skip everything. This adds a little bit of involvement and a bit of investment, and you can probably expect there's a lot of science behind getting people to interact with information that's given to them and how well they retain that information. I'm not a scientist, so don't quote me on that, but I feel like I've heard it talked about. So going back over into my dialogue class, that next dialogue is also a way that you can trigger dialogue. You can just say the next dialogue is this, and now this is kind of a byproduct of how I used to do it. So my new convention for this, and I know it's terrible practice to change conventions part way, is I just give it the ID, and then it's triggered by its own ID being given. Previously, I was triggering it with like a string, because it's just string comparison. That's how triggering is used. This next dialogue was added long after I added options. It used to just string compare whichever option you chose, but I needed a way to go from dialogue to dialogue just by the way that I decide it. So that's how next dialogue came to be, and I didn't really have any ideas for conventions for that, but that's the one I'm going with right now, because it's the easiest to model in my Excel document, which I'll show off very briefly. This is currently what I'm using to just sort of outline my narrative. Not everything that's currently in my game is actually in this document. I'm kind of playing catch up a little bit. I was given this document by a narrative design professor at my school. The professor that really specializes in that. And so I was like, man, going forward, I should really make use of this. And this entire dialogue, which is the longest dialogue in my game, was modeled through this document. But everything that I had made before getting this obviously has not been put in yet. A little bit of it has, a little bit from this. I mean, it's so little that, it's not really worth it. But that's kind of where we're at right now. And last but not least, we've got these two ints for events on start and events on end, and this is definitely the jankest part of my system. So I want to be able to, for every dialogue, it has the opportunity to trigger a function when the dialogue begins and when the dialogue ends. And the way that I denote that it's not triggering a function in my XML is I just put a -1. However, in order for the function to properly trigger, it has to have its ID. So this is the ID 1103, and so because this one has a function that's played on end, I give it 1103. And then in my inspector, if I go and look at the dialogue trigger component that I have, it's right here, dialogue trigger new, because I used to, when I transitioned to XML, I'd already had some dialogue in the game and I didn't want to delete all of it, so I just made another script and slowly but surely replaced everything that had already been made. But where's an example of one with... Alright, here's a good example of one with functions. So this one is telling me that there are 3 events in start, and a big downside of my system is I have to explicitly define this myself in the inspector, and so far I don't really have a workaround for that. It's just sort of a downside that I think I'm just going to deal with for the duration of this project. If I change it at this point, I have to go back and change everything that's already implemented. I don't think that would be worth it. So it's just running through the Unity event system. These are all functions given to it, and on these I have these events on start keys, and the size of this should match the size of events on start. And so there's keys at index 1001, 1007, and 1016. And basically what that's saying is if dialogue with ID 1001 is playing in the dialogue manager, it's going to reach a point where it's like, okay, well, do you have a function that triggers? And if it does, then it's going to go ahead and index into this array of events, because that's how it looks in script. It's simply an array of Unity events, and it's going to index into it, which of course an even greater downside is that these have to match. So the functions that are associated with the dialogue ID 1001 have to be the first one in that array, because they need to share indexes. And this would definitely be a really bad solution, I think, if this was being used in like a team of multiple people. But since I'm the only person working on this, it's definitely a little quirk that I can easily work around myself, as long as I'm just very aware of what I'm doing. And so far, it hasn't been a huge problem. It's always a little bit tedious to define new events, but just having used it for a little while at this point, I can do it rather quickly. I was going to show off my XML parsers just like real quick. So basically, it's a singleton architecture, so it's got that public static parse XML main. I have it hard capped at 3 scenes, although it's looking like I'm going to have a 4th, so I guess this is going to change to 4. But that constant integer is used to create the list of, or the dictionary of scenes, which that's this right here. I guess it's an array of dictionaries. Yeah, because there's one dictionary for each scene. So basically, when the game starts, any dialogue trigger that's on something is going to have a list of IDs and the scene that it is pulling from, and it's going to try to grab all of those necessary values by ID, and return them as a dialogue. And that's basically how I load in as many dialogues as I need for a given character in the game. The dialogue manager is just, in comparison to the other stuff, a lot larger, since this is what's doing all of the legwork. So a couple of key things that I want to go over a little bit are the dialogue boxes, because a cool thing about my game is on a sentence by sentence basis you can change the dialogue box, and this is the last little thing that I denote in my XML file. So anything with brackets and this aggro inside denotes that this has the aggro dialogue box. There's another one that's bubbles, and the default is circles. Of course I have circles and bubbles because when I named 3 freaking things I made 2 sound insanely similar. But the circle is those black circles that are often seen. That's the default, so it's definitely the one you see the most. Aggressive is pretty much exclusively used with Kevin right now, and then the bubble is pretty much exclusively used with K3V2N and K3V3N, since it kind of shows a little bit of a speaker position, but it's like that kind of generic like text bubble with a little bit of fun spine animation. How does this work? What happens when you want to start a dialogue? So you get this, you have an array of dialogues, because rarely is a single dialogue by itself. You have the speaker object, which is necessary for determining where the dialogue window needs to be created, because it's created in world space. And you have the start index, so in this array, which dialogue is actually the starting one, because we don't always want to start on the first one. It's not always like a linear progression through it, given that we have dialogue choices, and sometimes if you leave a dialogue, it'll set that index to something else if you return. We don't want things like a character introducing themselves every time you talk to them. That would be extremely annoying. It's possible for you to be unable to talk, so in that case we just return. And we have a little coroutine just so since the same button used for talking to somebody / interacting is also used for skipping, we don't want you to press the button and immediately skip to the next dialogue, so there's a slight delay before it allows you to actually skip, so that you have to press that button a second time. And it's possible for I don't know why, I don't remember exactly why this checks, but if there isn't a dialogue canvas instance in the world, it's going to create one, which, if it's continuing a dialogue, so if a dialogue triggered this one, the dialogue window might already be created, in which case I don't need to create it again, and I already have a reference to it. So, obviously we're pausing, and we can't be awaiting options when we start a dialogue. That would be a holdover from if you chose an option that triggered this dialogue. And our current dialogue index is our start index, of course. And the D tree is basically, as you can see, dialogue, which is an array of dialogues. So that's basically storing all of the dialogue that this NPC has. And that's how I'm able to, search through. If, say, you press an option, it searches through all of the dialogues and sees if one has a trigger corresponding to that option that you chose. And of course we do a little bit of audio stuff. It runs through my bad audio manager, which I talked about in my overview, or at least mentioned rather. Says being talked to, because that's important for lots of things. Just sanity check here to clear the sentences. And we're just running with a queue. This was actually part of what I got from that tutorial video that I found on YouTube. It's probably a pretty easy one to find if you just look up like dialogue manager tutorial Unity. Simple enough, but it was a great foundation to get started with. So the D trigger, this dialogue trigger new, contains references to the Unity events that can be triggered either on beginning that dialogue or at the end. So I store a reference to it for that. So right here is where we check for events on start, since we are in the start dialogue function. And then I keep a reference to it for later, because eventually we'll need to check for any events that are on end. So then we go into display next sentence. So if you're typing, I check for input and update. So if it's currently typing and you press a button, it'll quick finish it, basically just immediately display the sentence. Pretty standard dialogue convention in games. If it's typing, you press the button, it finishes itself. You press it again, it goes to the next one. Pretty simple. Source play one shot, that's just playing the next sound effect, so the sound effect that plays when you're going to the next dialogue. It's just a little boop. So if we've displayed the whole dialogue, basically what we need to do is trigger these end events, because the dialogue is at its end. And now we're setting awaiting option if there are options. So this is how it's just determining that, okay, we're waiting for the player to press a button to trigger the next dialogue. But however, there can be a defined next dialogue, so there can be a dialogue with this next dialogue string filled out, and in that case we are already on our way to the next dialogue, and we are just calling next dialogue with this this set in. And if there's no options available, then we just end it. So if I want, say in here, I want a dialogue to just wherever the last one is, so I can scroll down. Here's a good choice. So right here, there's a sentence, there's a voice, there's no options, there's no trigger options, there's no next dialogue, nothing. I guess trigger options don't really matter, but there's no options, there's no next dialogue, so this will just exit once you read this sentence and go to the next. So right here is just a coroutine used to type the sentence. I say just, but there's a lot of shit that happens in here. because despite the fact that it says type sentence, it's also in charge of determining which dialog box needs to be displayed, and there's also a lot of other logic that goes into typing sentences, given that I have all of these different tags that I've defined. This is actually a holdover from my old project, so if I typed in brackets player name, like how I type in brackets aggro, it would replace it with whatever file name you inserted at the very beginning. And it was because the previous project that I used this with was kind of an RPG-ish game. It definitely had RPG elements, and that's what I was going for, but it was a kind of an overscoped project. It was very ambitious for my skill level. I say that as if I've gotten much better since then, but that was only last spring, not terribly long ago, still in the same year. But yeah, if I wanted someone to mention you by name, I would just type brackets player name in all caps, and it would just replace it with whatever name you inserted at the beginning. But I also use it for determining dialog boxes, because I guess I just didn't want another tag. So circles, aggro, and bubble, that's where it basically changes this dialog box sprite. And also I remove this sentence split. Reason being, I don't want to actually display, you know, brackets, circles, or something. That'd be kind of jank. And this is just a bunch of like stuff, very hard coded, as you can see. Dialog canvas instance.transform.getChild 0, you know, the first child, and you get the first child of that child, and you get the game object. It's very jank, but it's because I made those prefabs and I know where the transforms are, and they're not subject to change at this point. The dialog box and the text box that's associated with it are separate prefabs. You can't just have a single text box for all of them, because they're somewhat different sizes. Some of them are taller than they are wide, some are wider than they are tall. So it's two prefabs that kind of appear as one. Who is talking? I don't remember what that does. Another holdover from my previous project. There were a couple of instances where the player had dialogue, since it was an RPG. And so there was a little bit of special logic for that. I guess I'm keeping it for now, but I don't think in this project there's going to be any times like that. But if I have the option to do it if I need to, which is kind of nice. So we're going to concatenate all words into a single string. There's a lot of string splitting going on because we have to deal with the effects, and of course it does get kind of nasty. Oh, and there's another little special thing. So for colored text, which is sort of I think that's just a part of normal Text Mesh Pro, but you would denote them by bracket or angle brackets with a hex value, and then angle brackets with /color, kind of like that HTML tag looking stuff. However, one issue with typing text is that it doesn't recognize that it's a color tag until you've typed out all of the text and you reach that closing angle bracket on the closing tag. So a little workaround I had to do for that is determine beforehand if there's any angle brackets in the string, and if so, I need to print out from the first angle bracket to the closing one all at once in a single loop, as to avoid outputting, you know, color tags into the text box. So that's what I'm doing right here. And then of course we're just restoring things, because we got to remove those tags. They're still technically within that sentence string, so you have to get rid of them and then restore your sentence. I guess I play the voice down here too. And right here is where we attach the effect to the sentence, if there is an effect within that sentence data that's currently being displayed. And finally, we can loop. And originally I think this was originally yield return null, so it would just be one frame in between numbers, but I added in the sentence speed variable, because there was an NPC that I wanted to speak very slowly. So now sentence speed kind of determines how quickly it loops. And of course, once you've reached beyond this closing brace, then the entire dialogue has been typed out, at which point we want to stop that voice that's looping as it types and set typing to false. And I think with that, we've pretty much gone through all this. This next dialogue is just, it's given in a string. It says option. It can also be a next dialogue, and it loops through the array, the D tree, which is the array of dialogues that it has, and it sees if any of those dialogues have trigger options that match option. And if so, then we just start next dialogue with that one as the starting index. Beyond that, that's pretty much what my dialogue manager looks like. So you can see it a little bit in action. I think it actually is shown off a little bit better in my first scene in Robot Dream. That intro cinematic is skippable. No prompt yet, but the prompt should be very easy to add. So right here is a good example. This is where one that has an effect. Unfortunately, it won't play the effect until the entire dialogue is typed out, but that's not really too big of a deal. So here we're just typing it out at normal speed. And right there's an example of a dialogue that has both an effect and an audio clip attached to it. That's also another one. I guess the burst at the beginning is similar. Right here, this guy's kind of nice. This is my guy that has very slow typing. And right here's a character with a different text box. And that's pretty much all there is to my dialogue system. I think we ran through the entire thing. Yeah, so, I mean, if you've made it this far, wow. Good for you. I'm impressed. Alright, well, that's me. That's Binary Dreams audio system, designed and implemented by Ryan Woods. Love to see it. Peace.